So I recently saw a video from the Fextra Life channel, of all places, about Elden Ring's anniversary and how, did it live up to its hype? And I figure if Fextra Life's going to throw in their 2 cents, who better than me to also throw in their 2 cents into if Elden Ring lived up to its hype and how good it was and this and that. So what is hype anyway? Well, the shortened variant of the English word hyper, which means to put an insane amount of expectations on a video game just based on a personal preference or a public perception of a gaming company. We saw it most notably with Cyberpunk 2077, which was sort of coasting off of its CD Projekt Red's reputation due to the Witcher games, namely The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt, and how they pretty much delivered a very solid product, in my opinion, and they gave us 2 really standout DLCs. They also gave us a bunch of free little downloadable content quests and items and shit like that, stuff that other gaming companies definitely would have charged for. I definitely have to give them credit there. They really like to give people what they paid for and then some. But as we all know, that did not save them from the backlash about Cyberpunk 2077. And after that game's disastrous release, many were skeptical now about From Software's next game, even though they've never missed. Again, at least in my opinion. FromSoft was also riding on a record high after the success of Sekiro, so it was definitely a similar situation. Well, that was until Elden Ring came out and blew the nips off of every single gaming commenter and reviewer, almost entirely on the internet, except for that one guy who was copyright claiming everybody. But as we all know, gaming journalism and community-created content can quickly turn into a circle jerk, either for good or bad. And sure, sometimes that's deserved. But I guess what that Fextra Life was trying to answer was, did Elden Ring live up to everybody's expectations? And that's kind of an impossible question to answer, because I imagine everybody had slightly different expectations. Some people tempered them because of games like Cyberpunk. I know a lot of people were worried about the open world element. And now since it's come out, I've seen some people say that it's not really an open world game any more than any of the other Souls games, mainly because there's certain areas you can't really walk to. But outside of the consecrated snowfield, the mountaintops of giants, the Halleck tree, and crumbling Farum Azula, you can walk pretty much anywhere. You can walk through the Weaving Peninsula, up through Limgrave, to the right through Caelid if you want, to the left through Liurnia, and up through Leyndell if you take the ruin-strewn precipice, all without warping at all. And it's not until you get to the snowfields and the mountaintops that you actually need to see a loading screen. I think some people were also worried that the open world would be a bit like Breath of the Wild's, and how I do think that Elden Ring's open world suffers from some of the same things that Breath of the Wild did, but not as bad. Breath of the Wild had like 3 or 4 bosses that you could find out in the wild, and that was it, just different versions of them. It was a bit like God of War 2018. Elden Ring offers a bit more variety in that regard, but since there's so many bosses, there's obviously going to be a whole hell of a lot of reused ones. And for the most part, the reuse of bosses in Elden Ring, it really isn't that bad. None of them are particularly lore-breaking outside of one. I'm looking at you, Godfroy. I'd say he was the worst example of a reused boss, since he was one of the Shard Bearers. And sure, there were some bosses that we literally had to fight multiple times, like Morgott/Margit and Mog. Morgott's has lore reasons, Mog's might also too. I'd say most of the other reuse, like with the Deathbird showing up at night in certain areas and the Godskin Apostle showing up at locations like the Chapel of Iglay or outside Ranni's Divine Tower, or even the 2 at Farum Azula, they all seem to have pretty solid lore reasons behind them. The only 2 that don't, I'd say, were the 2 in the Spirit Caller Cave. It's kind of weird. There were a lot of bosses I liked throughout the game. I thought Malekith was really hard. I still struggle on him. It's just because of how fast he moves. And because on playthrough like 5 on onward, he is just a one-shot kill no matter what you have. Or at least it certainly seems like. Basically, I see why he was the bane of all the demigods. He's really the only boss I dread fighting on every playthrough. A standout boss I really like, but isn't really a hard fight at all, it's actually a boss that pretty much hands its death to you, is the ancestral spirit deer down in Chauffeur River. There's also the regal variant, which I like too. But those 2 are very atmospheric boss fights. They've got perfect music, perfect visuals, and there's like the ghosts of random animals all around you. A very well done boss fight, if not an easy one. I do think that the grandness of it, though, makes up for how weak the boss is. But there's a lot of bosses I like. There's also a hell of a lot of bosses. Well, not really a hell of a lot, but there's definitely a handful of bosses that I really hate. And I'm looking at you, ulcerated tree spirit, or putrefied tree spirit, whichever tree spirit. I hate them all. Those bosses have the most egregious hitboxes and attacks I've ever seen in a FromSoft game. Yeah, they're not super hard, they're just really annoying, and there's way too many of them in the game. Then there's the Erdtree avatars where, yeah, there's a lore reason why there'd be so many of them in the game, but after a while it does get annoying putting them down. Especially because the Elden Stars attack they do, when you actually get it in the game, it is nowhere near as damaging as the one they use. So it also kind of makes them even more infuriating. I also want to say that there's probably no boss I hate more in FromSoft history than the final boss of Elden Ring, and that is of course the Elden Beast, and that's only because this fucking thing just runs away from you entirely. You know, if you want to know a easy way to deal with him though, just spam pest threads if you're near him, and it'll just pretty much dominate him. It pretty much wrecks any enemy that's of a large size. But still, I hate chasing that goddamn giant fish blob creature thing, galaxy, across the map endlessly just for it to swim across the map again. It's tiresome. But moving on. One thing I think Elden Ring really excels at, and honestly almost every Soulsborne game, and even some of the copycats excel at, is the varying designs of the enemies. Sure, some of the knights are just palette-swapped versions of each other, at least the regional ones, but this game has quite a diversity amongst its enemies. We've got demigods, misbegottens, omens, wraithcallers, those weird fallen hawk things down in the underground. There's also the Nox, the liquid silver tears, which is Elden Ring's version of a slime. And I'm really only scratching the surface of some of the enemies. There's trolls, pests, those weird ancestral minotaurs, no shortage of skeletons. There's also like 3 or 4 or maybe even 5 different types of Albinauric in total. Maybe even more than that if we count the Mog ones. So I think in that regard the game pretty much kills it with all the different enemies it has. And they're all pretty cool looking and none of them are really too annoying. Nothing as bad as the Winter Lanterns from Bloodborne, which I think were designed solely just to irritate the player and create some type of annoyance. Probably my only complaint about Bloodborne, but that's unrelated altogether. One thing I think that Elden Ring does very well is how it handles its lore. And just the overall world building and the pieces that were given to put the story together, I think all of that is handled very well. In most of the other Soulsborne games, you'd be forgiven for finishing the game and not really knowing what happened. I mean, sure, you really do have to skip through all the dialogue on some of them to get to that point, but it's definitely possible. I know a lot of people who have gotten to that point. And even going a step further, in most of the previous Soulsborne games, you're given a lot less overall information to the world and these godly type figures and characters, and even places and locations. Everything is all a bit more vague in previous Souls games. Basically, the lore is a bit more expansive in Elden Ring. That doesn't make it better or worse than any of the previous games. It just makes it easier to paint a clearer picture of what's exactly going on. And sure, when it comes to like Dark Souls 3, you can paint a pretty clear picture of what's going on, but you're still given overall much less information than we are in Elden Ring. I feel like this game on the whole has a nice mix when it comes to its lore. It's almost a bit like Elder Scrolls lore mixed in with Soulsborne lore and, put into a blender supposedly operated by this fucking degenerate. In my opinion, story-wise, it came out a pretty solid game. I wish there was like 2 more endings and that a couple things were different. And of course, in every Souls game, there's a bunch of cut content that I wonder at why it didn't make it in the game, like the Asimi Mimic Tier quest. That really should have been in the game to make it more difficult for people to get the Mimic Tier ashes. They made people go the extra mile for getting Ranni's Moon Knight Greatsword, and that still ended up being the ending that most people chose. So I honestly don't think any less people would have gotten it. It just would have made it a little more difficult and more rewarding to get it, other than just fighting a copy of yourself that admittedly wrecked my shit the first time I fought it. But yeah, I thought the story was great. I liked pretty much all of the endings. They all had their own little appeal except for the basic ending. That one never has any appeal, in my opinion. Personally, I'm a bit torn on which ending is my favorite. I used to think Frenzied Flame in the beginning, and then I thought Duskborn, but then I started thinking, actually, I think that the Age of the Curseborn is the true best ending, because it reverts everything sort of back to the Primal Crucible. But yeah, all this solid world building came from the fabled collaboration between the two greats Hidetaka Miyazaki and George R.R. Martin. And yeah, it's still argued a bit to this day what exactly George R. R. Martin did, but honestly, I can see bits of the wacky mind of George R. R. Martin mixed into the classic From Software formula. And again, I think the end result was solid and exactly what they were hoping for, at least when it comes to story and world building. I also want to say that the legacy dungeons, for the most part, are all pretty solid, each in their own right. It's tough for me to pick a favorite, but I'm really fond of Fair Missoula as a whole. But I think either Ray Lucaria or Volcano Manor is probably going to edge it out for best dungeon in the game. At least in my head, I can see why people would pick some of the other ones. But I can see why people would pick other dungeons. I mean, I understand the appeal of Lanedale and Stormvale castles. But look, the game's not without its flaws. It has a great deal of boss reuse. Sometimes it's egregious, other times it makes sense from a lore standpoint. Any game this big is going to have some amount of boss reuse. Outside of the legacy dungeons, most of the caves and smaller dungeons are overall pretty small and not that unique. There's definitely a handful of exceptions. There's even a handful of lesser legacy dungeons like Shaded Castle and Carrion Manor that are pretty damn good in my opinion. The various crystal caves and catacombs remind me a bit of how they were done in Oblivion or Morrowind. They all have a similar structure and similar enemies. Yeah, the Jade Gargoyle Imps fucking suck, but a lot of these dungeons don't take a whole hell of a lot of time. And yeah, the catacomb watchdog things are probably some of the most goofily designed and animated enemies in any From Software game, or maybe even any modern game. Can't really forgive that, how they just sort of float in the air and slam down. I don't know, am I the only one who's bothered by how that looks? Small little nitpick, but I definitely think there's a handful of catacombs and caves that do stand out and are pretty cool. And the teleporting chests were a nice little touch to get you stuck somewhere and have to dig yourself out of a pretty deep cave occasionally. I think that while some of these caves and catacombs can feel repetitive, they're different enough to where you can definitely see that effort was made. And that's really all I ask for. I can't stand when things are just copy and pasted like how we have in Dragon Age 2. And yeah, some of the ruins, after you kill the boss, it just has one room and a treasure, but that's to me like how Breath of the Wild had its shrines. That game had its puzzles, and this game, while it does have a few puzzles, has bosses for us to kill. That's the FromSoft way. Another thing I think that Elden Ring handles very well is the diversity amongst its weapons and its armor choices, as well as the various Ash of Wars that you can add to them to increase their usefulness and further diversify your options. There's also quite a bit of spells and incantations. Yeah, some of them are sort of useless, and that's just always the case in these games, but there is plenty of options when it comes to your faith and intelligence-based arsenals, as well as a pretty good amount of catalysts to cast them from too. My only complaint is that it seems like there's a bit of an imbalance between spells and incantations. It seems like there's a lot more useful spells and a lot less useful incantations, but that being said, I'm a certified faith user, something I learned from Dutch in Red Dead 2. And I really had no complaints. There's really a whole hell of a lot of options even when it comes to incantations. I would just say that there's maybe more spells. But I haven't counted. Maybe there's the same amount. It just seems like there's a lot less WMD style incantations in comparison to the spells. Or excuse me, sorceries. And honestly, it comes down to just my little nitpick that we don't have certain incantations for like Morgoth's sword and Morgoth's hammer, and maybe a better version of Elden Star. I actually didn't really notice this whole disparity until I played a spell-based character. And while the faith users certainly do have a lot of choices, it really feels like there's a lot more useful or more viable spells than there is incantations, even if there's the same number of overall spells and incantations. I don't know, just my own personal little thing, and again, it's not really much of a complaint. And also, I like a lot of the armor in this game, but I still think that it is not the top contender for best armor choices in a Souls game. To me, that'll always be Dark Souls 2, just for its sheer amount of really cool armor sets. And then it's tied between Dark Souls 3 and Bloodborne. Bloodborne doesn't really have a whole lot, but you don't really have a whole lot of weapons either, and the armor sets you do have are pretty cool, in my opinion at least. Although I would say maybe Dark Souls 3 does beat it out just because of the sheer variety. Although, like I said, Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring's armor choices have nothing on Dark Souls 2. That game really does just have the best fashion and style. But one thing that Elden Ring blows all of the other games out of the water on is the NPCs and the quest lines. Now, I know at launch, Alexander's quest didn't really have a true end. There was no Jar Baron. Nefeli's quest also didn't have an end, and Patch's quest ended with him faking his death. But those all got fixed with patches. Patches. And they were like minor nitpicks anyway. This game's quests also have a good deal of choices that you have to make. I mean, a lot for a Souls game. It's not like Mass Effect or anything. But it's sort of like an early Fallout or Elder Scrolls game when it comes to the quests and NPCs. There's usually always more than one or two ways to go about a situation, which is comparable to how you can go about exploring the overall world and dealing with the bosses. Sure, some of the quests are just as intricate and missable as previous From Software games, and maybe some are less rewarding than others, but I still think that this game took major strides when it comes to the side quest department. Sekiro did pretty good too, I just need to replay that game. It's the one I'm least versed on, out of the From Software games that I've played at least. I did recently get the manga about Hanbei the Undying, and I think I might make a video about it because it was really interesting. I just wanted to replay Sekiro for footage on it. I'm getting off topic. There's plenty of really cool quest lines in this game. Millicent's quest, Celavis's quest, Selin's quest, Fia. I could go on all day, you know. There's also plenty of treacherous NPCs, like I said already. Celavis, there's Gideon, the all-blowing. There's the confounding shit-eater. And all these quest lines are really compelling, even the shit-eaters. And they do a lot to world build and add to the overall lore of the game. And the dialogue and all the shit we learn from these quests does a whole hell of a lot more for the lore than the average item descriptions that we've grown accustomed to. Not saying that style is bad, that's one of my favorite things about From Software lore. I love reading every single item description I could find. Even like all the little crafting ingredients and shit like that, just looking for a little lore nugget that would maybe help me piece together a theory I've been working on. That shit has caused me to do that in every single video game I play now. I look at every little description of every little item. But I definitely think that the NPCs and the quest line are extremely well done. And it's a major step up for From Software games as a whole, where that stuff definitely kind of takes a backseat. Not saying there aren't compelling side quests in previous Souls games or Bloodborne, because there definitely are. I'm a lore guy, you know, of course I appreciate those. But the characters in this game's mouths move when they talk. You guys gotta take a minute to appreciate that. We've come a long way. And when it comes to difficulty, I know a lot of people have said, you know, Elden Ring should have an easy difficulty and all that. I think a lot of that, though, is just the journalists kind of blowing it up and making it seem more widespread than it actually is. Or it could be the fact that Elden Ring sold over 20 million copies and there's just a lot of new people to Souls games. Elden Ring is a lot of people's first Soulsborne game, and that difficulty curve would be very new to some of them. So that's pretty understandable, and I think From Software accounted for that sufficiently, because there are so many ways to circumvent the difficulty in this game. We've got spirit ashes, plenty of yellow phantoms that can help us out, co-op as always. There's plenty of overly busted weapon arts or ashes of war on certain unique boss weapons or just unique weapons. Like the blasphemous sword, for example. Whenever I had trouble with the boss in my first playthrough, I would just resort to using the weapon art. No, you know, not spamming it. Sometimes if they were that really weak, then why not? But just getting the timing down of making sure it always landed when I used it. And I know a lot of people love that Hoarfrost Stomp, especially because you could put it on like any weapon. It was basically a guaranteed win button if you used it and spammed it on any boss, or even invading players sometimes. I know it happened to me. That's how I discovered how broken it was. It got used on me. Of course, that got nerfed. Another weapon plenty of people were using to circumvent the difficulty of the game was Rivers of Blood. The weapon of Okina of the Reeds, the dude who wears a mask of himself. He was, of course, a bit of a badass, and he gave Mog a cut, and Mog was like, "Hey man, join me. I don't want any part of that fight. I'll give you the power of a demon so you can do that to way more people for way longer." Again, I'm getting off topic. But this game, I think, really did kill it, especially when it comes to the visuals, like the art style and art direction. I mean, look at all the landmarks and beautiful vistas throughout the game. And again, that's nothing new when it comes to From Software games, but this is definitely the evolution of everything we've had before. You can see the DNA of every single previous Souls game inside Elden Ring, which now sounds kind of hilarious when I word it like that, but you guys get what I'm saying. I do have one complaint about the patches that they've used to fix the game, and it doesn't have anything to do with any weapon nerfs or anything like that, even though there's a few egregious choices that I could pick to complain about. But no, my complaint is reserved solely for whoever thought it would be a good idea to make the perfumer that's sitting in the burning Albinoric village no longer play his flute. It's like they have something against cool atmosphere or something. They just wanted that gone. Was it a mistake where the perfumer is never supposed to play the flute? Was that only supposed to be a page thing? I don't know. I want somebody to put that back into the game or mod that back into the game for me, because that would be really cool. To me, the Albinauric village will never be the same and will never have that same feeling as it did at launch, because that perfumer is not sitting in a pile of dead bodies playing his flute, and I don't know. It's hard to convey why I liked that so much, what it added to the overall setting, but I think I've complained enough about it. And I know I was supposed to have that iceberg video, or not really a video, but a stream out today, but I'm still learning how to work OBS, because whenever I look at the iceberg in OBS, it looks like impossible to fucking read. It becomes even further pixelated, so I gotta figure out if I have to make a new copy of it or something, so we have this anniversary video for us instead. I almost forgot to mention my hands down favorite thing that Elden Ring has, and that is an extensive underground section, or multiple underground sections technically. There's Mogwin Palace, there's Shofra River, and then the ant-filled Anzel River, and of course, Deeproot Depths. Each having their own distinct looks to them and having multiple points of entry, all full of bosses and pretty unique and cool enemies. I could go on for days about why I like the underground section so much, but I'm already, Look, this has already gone on way longer than I expected it to, but what I'm trying to say is, yes, Elden Ring lived up to the hype for me and for many people. It's not a perfect game, but I think it is the perfect evolution of FromSoft's games as a whole, especially with that new jumping mechanic, courtesy of our man in Japan, Sekiro. I definitely think that this is what a AAA game should be. I played through it like a countless amount of times. I've gotten every ending. I still don't get tired of it when I hop back on it to get footage. I can understand some people's problems with it, but I think that if you liked any previous Dark Souls game, there's really no reason not to love this one. And it hardly really even feels like it's been a year since this game came out. That's kind of nuts. That means it's almost been a year since I started this channel. Again, that's pretty nuts. But that's really all I had to say about all of this, so if you guys stuck around for all that rambling and you found it somewhat enjoyable, please consider liking the video. If you disliked it, please dislike it, and if you like hearing these rambles, please consider subscribing. It would really help the channel out during YouTube's dire straits. But without further ado, let us have our honored madman, aka the poor man's lore man, patented outro. Certified GMO free. I didn't want to sound too biased, but it's kind of hard not to. Talking about this game kind of gave me a YouTube channel, so I can't really, well, you guys know my opinions about the game. Next up, we might do a little bite-sized lore piece about a certain character in God of War, or from Norse mythology, I mean. Then we've got some Zelda stuff and Fallout stuff, King Bulblin, something about Dead Money, the best DLC in New Vegas, or, well, to me, it's tied, of course, with Old World Blues. Anyway, I'm rambling again. I'm signing off. See you guys. Have a good one.